MAF scaling versus MAF tuning. What is the difference between the two? MAF scaling applies a fixed correction to the MAF sensor signal. It is used to give the engine ECU a signal which correctly indicates that the mass of air entering the engine. MAF tuning is a bit more involved. We are tuning the fueling to get the AFR targets we want, which is different to what the engine ECU wants. MAF scaling is for engines which have a good tune, but we have changed something in the intake that means the MAF signal is no longer giving the ECU an accurate picture of the amount of air entering the engine. The ECU has AFR targets, and we are scaling the MAF to make it easier for the engine ECU to achieve them. MAF scaling suits cars which use a wideband Lambda sensor and use closed loop Lambda feedback under all engine conditions. So that's where we would use MAF scaling, and then come on to MAF tuning, which is a bit different. MAF tuning is when we want to change our air fuel ratios for whatever reason in our engine map. So for example, the engine may be targeting 13.5 AFR at full load, but we want to bring that down to 12.4. MAF tuning suits cars which use a narrow band Lambda sensor, or cars which do not use closed loop feedback at higher loads. This is very important, these. We come into it in a bit more detail. MAF scaling. We scale a MAF when we have changed something in the inlet tract. We have done something that alters the way the MAF reads the air that's entering the engine. We need to scale the MAF sensor to compensate for these changes so we get accurate data, accurate airflow data going to the ECU. It could be a different diameter MAF housing. We could have changed the MAF sensor itself. We could have fitted a cold air intake. Could have fitted a cold air intake which moves the MAF, either locating it in a different distance from bends in the intake, and or it changes the diameter of the tube where the MAF was mounted on the stock pipework. Changing the tube itself, e.g. from corrugated, like a rubber hose, like the corrugated rubber hoses that we see from the factory, to something smooth, i.e. a silicone hose. This could also affect the accuracy of the MAF sensor signals. How do we know if MAF scaling is required? It's really quite simple. If we have an OBD scanner, we can go into that and look at our short and long-term fuel trims, and I would say short trim is probably the only thing we need to look at. And this will let us know if the ECU is having to compensate for incorrect readings. If we're looking at the short-term fuel trim when we're driving, then we can see that the fuel trims are like over plus or minus 10%, and the only change has been the MAF sensor. Then it's a fair assumption to say that we need to scale a MAF sensor signal, because ideally we want those fuel trims to be less than plus or minus 5% under most conditions. So that's the MAF scaling. MAF tuning. MAF tuning is when we want to adjust the fueling of our engine. We want to change our AFR targets. We want a different AFR to what the engine ECU wants. The MAF sensor is still reading the air in the same way. The sensor reading is still accurate, but the signal the MAF sensor sends to the ECU does not give us the AFR that we want under those conditions. In this case, we need to tune the MAF sensor signal to get the fueling that we need or want. The amount of adjustment, things to bear in mind. We can tune the MAF. Well, the amount that we can tune the MAF will vary from car to car. Some ECUs will allow big adjustments to the MAF signal. Maybe we can add 50% to the MAF sensor signal, take away 50% for a given engine load and a given RPM. Others won't. Others will throw a check engine light because it's outside of the engine map for that. They'll say that is an implausible signal. So on some cars, MAF tuning, you can get the results you need. On others you won't. There are also other consequences to tuning the MAF sensor signal, and there's a link to the article, well, a link to an article specifically on that in this article. If you want to read this article, here's a link in the video description. So coming on to cars with wideband Lambda sensors, if we are scaling the MAF, wideband Lambda sensors pose no issues to us. When we scale the MAF, we are just making the signal accurate. We're not trying to change anything in the engine ECU. We're not trying to change the map. We just want to give the engine ECU an accurate signal. However, when the car is constantly looking at the AFR, piggyback units which alter the MAF sensor signal to change the AFRs, for example something like the AFC Neo, will probably be of limited and in reality probably no use to us at all. In these cars we either need to go into the car's ECU and alter the AFR targets there. We cannot alter the MAF sensor signal to alter the AFRs with a car that's got a wideband Lambda sensor. At the bottom of the article I've put a video how important is MAF sensor placement. Does an aftermarket intake need a remap? And I've put a link here to Motor Video. They've done a video on potential MAF sensor signal issues when a cold air intake is fitted to a car. So they compared stock intake, stock airbox, stock MAF sensor location to a cold air intake which moves the MAF to a different location, and you can see what sort of issues you can run into there. So if we're scaling the MAF, we can compensate for this different MAF sensor reading. That's all for now. Look after yourselves and I'll see you in the next video.